Hello, I'm Adrian van Breda and I'm a social work lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. And this is a lecture for the course in clinical social work called Behavioral and Environmental Change, where we'll be exploring a number of practice models for clinical practice. This video addresses two practice models. First of all, narrative therapy, and secondly, psychodynamic practice. In this lecture, I'm going to be speaking about narrative theory, or rather the theory that underlies narrative practice. By theory, I'm referring quite broadly and inclusively to a range of ways of making sense of and understanding people and their problems, society, and the process of change. So it is all of this thinking that underlies practice that I'm going to try and address in this lecture in relation to narrative therapy. In order to be an advanced practitioner and not just a technician of practice, one cannot simply know the techniques involved in a practice model. You also have to understand the theory that underlies it. It is when you have a thorough grasp of the theory underlying a model that you can apply its processes and techniques in flexible, nuanced ways to address the specific and unique needs of each client or group that you are working with. This is what makes you an advanced practitioner, and this is what constitutes a clinical social worker as opposed to a generic social worker. So in this first lecture, I'm going to be outlining the theory that underlies narrative therapy practice. Narrative therapy was developed primarily by Michael White. Certainly of all the people that have written about narrative therapy, including him, people like David Epstein and Malcolm Payne and others, Michael White's name is most closely associated with narrative therapy. He is the originator of this practice model. This for us is really quite exciting because Michael White is a social worker. He died a few years ago, but lived and worked in Australia and started the Dulwich Centre, where he was a family therapist. There are not that many practice models that have been developed by social workers. And so to have this one, narrative therapy, which has become very widely recognized around the world, is used particularly by pastoral counselors, that's particularly Christian ministers who train in counseling and pastoral counseling, make extensive use of narrative therapy as their clinical approach. It's a very exciting thing for us as social workers to have this legacy from one of our own. Michael worked quite closely with David Epstein, who was also the Dulwich Centre, and together they wrote a number of books and articles, and David Epstein has made his own unique and specific contribution to narrative therapy. So these two names, Michael White particularly, and David Epstein to a slightly lesser degree, are the two key names that we associate as key figures in the field of narrative therapy. And you should really make an effort to read some of their original writings. Both of them write in very accessible ways. And although Michael White can theorize quite deeply and sophisticatedly, a lot of his literature is very practice-oriented and really nice and interesting to read. So in this lecture, I want to cover 7 theoretical foundations, so 7 aspects of theory that Michael White has drawn on in constructing narrative therapy. His practice model, narrative therapy, compared to some other practice models such as task-centered social work and even solution-focused therapy, which in some ways is quite similar to narrative, is deeply rooted in theory. And so when one tries to practice narrative therapy just in terms of its practice and its techniques and use things like externalizing questions and so on, you might find that they fall flat, and generally the reason why they fall flat is because you don't have an adequate grasp of what underlies the therapy. So we're going to work through these 7 theoretical constructs. They are not the easiest to understand, and quite honestly, for me personally, they're not the easiest to explain either, because they draw on quite deep philosophy, and I never studied philosophy. So we're going to start with the interpretive method, which was developed by Bateson. And then we're going to work our way clockwise around the circle. We'll look at analogy by Goffman, knowledge and power by Foucault, postmodernism by Ricoeur, post-structuralism, social constructionism, and finally deconstructionism by Derrida. Now, these different terms and approaches are all actually bodies of philosophy. Most of them are philosophies and theories of philosophy. And so they're quite deep and sophisticated. So go through this lecture slowly. You may want to listen to it 2 or 3 times in order to grasp some of the main issues. And I always encourage you to do some additional reading, which is prescribed for this lecture. So let's start with the interpretive method. So the first theory that we're going to look at is the interpretive method, which was developed by a chap called Bateson. Bateson was an English anthropologist, a linguist, and a cyberneticist who lived from 1904 to 1980. And he's particularly well known for his application of cybernetics to the behavioral sciences. Now, cybernetics is a particular form of systems theory. We know about general systems theory and so on. Cybernetics is one particular important aspect of systems theory, followed by second-order cybernetics theory, which really speaks about feedback loops and how systems reinforce each other through a series not just of one-directional feedback, but feedback coming back, and so creating a loop around. And so Bateson's work in this regard has particularly influenced family therapists, and so if you've studied family therapy at all, you may well have encountered some of Bateson's work in regard to his work on cybernetics. In a publication by Michael White and David Epstein in 1990, they write about the interpretive method. And this interpretive method is part of Bateson's contribution to theory. And he speaks about a number of concepts in his work which Michael White pulls forward and applies into narrative therapy. And what I'll be focusing on are these kind of central concepts. So I'm not presenting the whole theory of Bateson. Rather, what I'm presenting are certain extracts of it that have directly influenced Michael White's thinking, which in turn influenced narrative practice. So the first of these ideas is the notion that the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. This is a phrase that Bateson uses quite regularly, and a concept that's quite important in his work and very important in narrative. When you think of a map, perhaps an old-fashioned map book like we used to use if we were navigating from home to a place that we hadn't been, or these days we might use Google Maps or Waze or Garmin or TomTom or something like that. That map that we use presents to us a representation of the ground. It is not the ground itself. We don't literally drive on the map. The map does not perfectly and completely represent everything that is on the ground. The map is a representation, a kind of a summary or a condensation of relevant and salient information on a piece of paper or on your screen, but it is not the territory itself. So simply by reading maps and looking at maps, we wouldn't necessarily actually be able to walk around on the ground and know and see things that we would expect to find there, because we've not really been looking at the ground itself. And through this, Michael White argues that we don't really know objective reality directly. We see the real world through these representations we have, these maps, which he will later on use as an analogy for what we call narratives. So the stories that we tell about our lives are very much like the maps that we use to navigate our way from A to B. The map is a helpful guide. The map provides a representation of the real world, but we shouldn't think and get confused that the map is the territory, because in fact, the map is not the territory. A second important concept that derives from Bateson's work is what he calls part-for-whole coding. Part-for-whole coding. He says that we have broad understandings of the world and how things work, and how people are, and how the earth is, and how animals are, and how climate is, and how the economy is, and so on. We have these broad understandings of the whole. And based on those broad understandings of the whole, we make sense of or code the parts. So when something specific happens to us, or something specific happens in the world, which we would then call a part, we make sense of that part within the broader framework of our understanding of the whole. In a sense, it's a paradigm or a schema. So at this present moment, actually, as I make this recording, we're in the kind of midst of coronavirus. The country's virtually been shut down because of the coronavirus. How do we make sense of this virus and this pandemic that we're experiencing? That is a part, it's a piece of our life experience. Well, each of us will make sense of it slightly differently depending on how we make sense of the world as a whole. So if you're a very religious person, for example, you might think of this as something that God has sent or something that God is using or something that has some spiritual significance. If you are an epidemiologist and you make sense of health issues in terms of the spreads of diseases and patterns of human movement and migration and so on, you might make sense of the coronavirus in a very different way based on your overall understanding of the world, which we call the whole. So we code parts in relationship to the whole, not in and of itself. We don't see the part for what it is. We see the part through the lens, if you want, almost like a pair of glasses, that is the whole. So we interpret events, specific events, parts, within broader social contexts of sense-making, which we call the whole. These are a network of premises and presuppositions that constitute our map of life. So we come back to the map again. Events, then, that don't fit into these maps don't exist for us. This is a very important point that Bateson makes. That if a part does not fit into the whole, we generally don't notice it. It doesn't really come into our senses. We don't perceive it, or even if we do notice it, we don't remember it and we don't worry about it. Things that don't fit into the whole seem to disappear and be invisible for us because the parts don't have a place in the whole. So Bateson writes that human sense organs can receive only news of a difference. And the difference must be coded into events in time, in other words, into changes, in order to be perceptible. So when things are kind of going along normally, we don't really notice them. In order for something to become noticed, it needs to stand out as something different and unique. When something different and unique happens, and particularly when it's coded into events and time, so something that moves through time, then it becomes perceptible, and it's that time that we can notice it. So I'm going to anticipate narrative practice and just try and touch on and briefly explain how the interpretive method is applied into narrative therapy. I'm not going to go into the therapy now because we'll do that in another lecture, but I want to make an initial link in this direction. So the first is that what Bateson refers to as maps is what Michael White in narrative therapy refers to as narratives. So the maps that we spoke about are our narratives. A narrative, therefore, is not life, in the same way that maps are not the territory. Our narratives, rather, are stories about life. They're stories that make sense of life, and they include the element of time, which, of course, a map doesn't do. A map is just about space, whereas narratives include space and time. The second application is that we move from structure towards interpretation in narrative therapy. Most family therapists, prior to Michael White's work, saw problems as the result of dysfunctional structures in the family. So we think of Mnuchin's work on structural family therapy. Mnuchin was a structuralist. He understood problems in families to result from structures that were not effective or suitable for a family. Instead, Michael White moves away from structuralism towards interpretivism. In other words, he is interested not so much in how families are structured, but rather in how families interpret the challenges, how they make sense of the difficulties that they face in life within their broader narrative maps. That's again the part for whole coding. So within the context of their overall understanding of the world, the whole, how do families then interpret and make sense of specific challenges, which are the paths? And a third important application of the interpretive method to narrative therapy is around the function of problems. Family therapists have traditionally understood that problems in a family, for example, a child who wets their bed, that these problems serve a function in the family. For example, when a child wets their bed, the parents who are in conflict might actually rally together. They may come together and work together in order to solve the problem that this child presents. And so the bedwetting then serves the function of trying to address a family problem. Narrative therapy does not really accept that idea that problems serve a function. Rather, they argue that when problems develop in families, when families encounter problems, families begin to adjust cooperatively to meet the challenges of the problem. So in a sense, problems in families develop in response to a problem that the family faces and doesn't really know how to develop. And so these problems, in a sense, develop a life of their own. Families begin to work around the problem almost as if the problem is something that lives in the family like another family member. So this is the interpretive method coming from Bateson that is really foundational to narrative therapy. The second concept that we want to have a look at in relation to narrative therapy is the notion of analogy, which comes from a guy called Goffman. And Goffman writes that all statements of meaning are interpretive. All statements of meaning are interpretive. So he's taking, in a sense, Batesman's interpretive method a little bit further and arguing that everything that we say is really an interpretation, that nothing is really objectively true, but rather everything is an interpretation. So he says the statements of meaning that we make are determined by our interpretive frameworks. And when he talks about interpretive frameworks, this is very similar to what Bateson means by our maps. The interpretive framework is not reality. It is the sense that we make of reality, in the same way that a map is not the territory, but rather a representation of territory. And Goffman refers to these as analogies. So rather than using the metaphor of a map, he uses the word analogy to refer to these interpretive frameworks. He writes that analogies determine our questions. They determine how we construct or perceive reality, and they determine the real effects of the world upon our experience. And so in a very real way, analogies determine and construct our lives. So before this, we were thinking of these interpretive frameworks or maps that we've been speaking about as ways of describing and making sense of the world, as if the world happens, and then afterwards we make sense of them using interpretation. What Goffman brings in that's a bit new is that these interpretations, which he's now calling analogies, in fact determine how we behave and they determine what we experience. So they don't just describe the world, they actually create the world. They create the kinds of experiences that we have. They define how we make sense of ourselves as people, and they define the kinds of experiences that we have as we live. So the analogies determine our questions rather than answering them. And they in fact construct how we perceive reality rather than being the perception of reality. And therefore they affect how we actually live our lives in the world. So Goffman refers to the text analogy. And so where Bateson was using very visual analogies like the map to illustrate what he understood as the interpretation, Goffman uses this notion of text, of something that we write down, so a written analogy. And he says that events end at a point in time, but meaning continues beyond that point and continues to influence life. And so what's really pivotal is not the event itself, but rather its meaning. So I want to give you an example of this. I want you to imagine that you lose somebody very close to you, let's say your parent or your spouse or one of your children, somebody that is really important to you dies. That event happens at a point in time. The doctor will have pronounced time of death. At that time, somewhere in the past, this thing happened to you. But that event that took place back then continues to influence your life all the way through to the present, doesn't it? It's not as if, well, it's in the past, therefore it's happened, therefore it's behind us. We can't really say Hakuna Matata, what's behind is behind and it's over and it's done. In fact, that past event continues to influence our present life experiences almost as if it's happening right now even though in fact it is not. And so what's happening is that it's not the event itself that is influencing our lives, but rather the meaning that we make of that event, how we continue to think about it in this present moment, how we understand it influencing us in this moment is what is really important. The event, of course, is important. It's not unimportant. But the meaning that we make of that event is really what determines our life in the future after the event has already finished. So in Goffman's terms, the meaning that we make of things is equivalent to the text. So when he talks about the text analogy, he's referring to the meaning that we make. So we make sense of our life by storying it, by creating stories that have a past and a present and a future, that have characters and events and plots and themes. And it's these narratives that we tell ourselves, and this is the text analogy, is like writing a story, a short story or a novel or a play. It is these narratives that help us make sense of our lives. So the narratives are the stories that we tell about our lives. And these narratives then become stories that shape our lives. So as we said in the previous slide, analogies don't just describe the real world, they in fact determine and construct our lives. Narratives in a similar way are not just stories we tell about our lives, they are also stories that shape who we are and who we are going to become in the future. Narratives have a past, present, and future, and they shape what we experience and how we experience it. But importantly, not all events fit into the narrative, and things that don't fit into the narrative are discarded. This takes us back to part for whole coding. That parts that don't fit into the whole tend to disappear. We don't really notice them. They sort of fall by the wayside. They slip down the drain into the sewers underneath the road. We don't notice them. And in a similar way, events that don't fit the overall narrative of our lives tend to be discarded or invisible. So Bruner, who writes in a similar area, says the following: it is in the performance or expression that we re-experience, relive, recreate, retell, reconstruct, and refashion our culture. The performance does not release a pre-existing meaning that lies dormant in the text. Rather, the performance itself is constitutive. Now that word constitutive is another word that we probably use very much, but it's this idea that the stories that we tell about ourselves and about the world in fact constitute or create or bring into being the world as we know it. So this is the point that we're making over and over again so far, which is that the stories, the analogies, the text, the performances don't merely describe the life. They in fact create our lives. And so the narrative is more than just a metaphor. It is, in fact, life itself. And so White and Epstein write in their book, with every performance, people are re-authoring their lives. We use this phrase sometimes a bit, and sometimes a bit pejoratively, fake it till you make it. You know that phrase? Fake it till you make it. The idea is that even though you might not really believe that you can do something, for example, speak in public, if you fake it and so you act as if you can actually speak in public, and you do actually speak in public, what you are doing is that you are creating a story of yourself as a public speaker. And if you do that enough times, you will begin to change the story that you have of yourself, and you'll begin to say, well, I am a public speaker, and you'll begin to actually be a public speaker. So by the way that we create narratives and tell stories about ourselves, in fact, what we are doing is that we are authoring our lives or re-authoring our lives. And here we hear this metaphor coming through of narrative therapy. It's a process of restorying or telling new stories about ourselves that begin to construct and create new lives for us. It's the analogy of the text. So how does Michael White apply the text analogy to therapy? Well, he would say that people come to therapy when aspects of their life experience, events in other words, or problems that they're facing, don't fit with their overall narrative. So there's a dissonance in a sense between what they're experiencing in this moment, some issue that they're facing, and the overall narrative that they have of their lives. And therapy then is a process of generating alternative stories, new narratives, new texts that facilitate the performance of new meanings and which in turn open up new possibilities that are helpful and satisfying. And so generally when I hear people saying, oh, narrative therapy is about telling stories, I say, no, that's really not what narrative therapy is about. But in some ways, it is about helping clients to construct new stories about themselves and about the life events around them that help them to move forward in more constructive, helpful, and satisfying ways. It is a process of authoring or storytelling. Narrative therapy also externalizes what we call the problem-saturated story, which we'll come back to a bit later, by externalizing the problem. So people generally come to therapy with a story of themselves that is saturated with the problem, that shows how they're overwhelmed and dominated and controlled and subordinated by the problem. We call that the problem-saturated story. It's the dominant narrative. It's the whole in the part for whole coding. And one of the ways that Michael White tries to help dethrone or disempower that problem-saturated story is by externalizing the problem that the person has. So whether that problem is depression or violence or alcoholism, we try to externalize that problem. And then we map the influence of the problem on the person. In other words, how does that problem influence the person? How does it run circles around them? How does it shape and harm them? And in so doing, we actually increase the personal agency of the person because they start to feel that I am not the problem. The problem is the problem. In addition, narrative therapies involves reclaiming discarded life experiences and events. And so we've said a number of times now that when things happen to us that don't fit our dominant narrative, we don't notice them. So when our dominant narrative is one about us being overwhelmed by problems, we won't notice those times when we actually have some control over the problem, when we don't allow the problem to dominate and overwhelm us. We won't notice those because they don't fit into the dominant story. So the part disappears because the whole is so dominant. And this is what we call unique outcomes in narrative therapy. And again, we'll come back to unique outcomes when we talk practice. So unique outcomes that don't fit into the dominant story are generally invisible to our clients and to ourselves in our own stories. And narrative therapy is about trying to recover and reclaim those unique outcomes. In addition, narrative therapy is about ascribing new meaning to these events. So once we've identified a unique outcome, we want to construct meaning. We want to begin to tell a story, a different story, a new story, an alternative story, using these events, these pieces of life experience that have gone unnoticed. And we weave them together to construct a new or alternative story. We imagine, we reauthor, we interpret. We really are crafting a new story about a person that draws on all these bits of life experience that are positive but generally overlooked. And then we publicize these new stories through audiences. In other words, we begin to help clients tell their story to other people and to actually live out their story in the real world. And in so doing, we almost become publishers, and we help our clients become publishers of these new stories. So I'm hoping you can hear through this, even if this doesn't all make sense to you right now, that the text analogy is quite a powerful one. In a sense, it's like how we write books, how we write stories, and how these stories don't just describe things that happen, but in fact create the life experiences that we have in future.